Oh sure, they buy a lot of ale, but I always find myself needing to rebuild after the giants have paid a visit. Belko, owner of Titan's Keg Tavern. How's it going, everybody? My name is Josh from Elder Drunken Highlander, and this is our deck tech video for Izzet Lifegain? It is! A janky casual EDH deck that uses a color-shifted strategy that primarily lies in the Abzan colors of black, green, and white. Despite not having any of the right colors though, this deck still manages to gain oodles of life, and can still be rather deadly in casual games. Most importantly though, this deck is just insanely fun to play. Before we get into the deck tech though, I just want to spend a little time discussing commander choices. I went with Dalakos as the commander for this deck because he does a great job at smoothing out our mana, and his flying and haste ability is incredibly good at life gain. There are some other viable commanders you could use for this archetype though, with just a few little tweaks. Tawnos is another great option that adds some more combo potential and can double life gain triggers for big swings. The various Niv-Mizzets are also considerations. Thanks to their synergies with lifelink spells and cards like Well of Lost Dreams, they would be great for pseudo-storm variants built around Aetherflux Reservoir. There are a plethora of options available for Izzet Lifegain players out there, and I would hardly say that this deck is the best variation. I would love to see some other attempts at Izzet Lifegain shared on our Discord server, which is a great place to find like-minded individuals to help build janky decks. No matter what shell you choose to use, your main strategy in this deck should be the same. Gain a lot of life and leverage it in order to make use of either Aetherflux Reservoir, which actually isn't our strongest or most reliable win con, just our most known one, or one of our other extra spicy win conditions that I will detail later in the video. Look to keep an opening hand that allows you to cast Dalakos. Once you have him out, you usually will have smooth sailing in terms of mana for the rest of the game. Having a life gain card in your opener can be helpful to get your life up high before people really start swinging, but it isn't essential to get things going with the deck. Ideal hands also contain some form of card advantage, a tutor, or one of our combos in it already to start. Just to note that when I say combos for this deck, I don't mean infinite ones. We do have one infinite combo in the deck which I will briefly go over, but it is so incredibly clunky and difficult to set up that by the time you get to the point where you can execute it, you usually have already won through other means. The combos in this deck are value-based, and while they can kill players in one go sometimes, they also need to spend a lot of resources in order to do so, and cannot go infinite because of that. They are also incredibly janky and fun, usually so much so that the reaction from the table when I win with them is often, "Wow, I ain't even mad." Before we take a look at those combos though, we should also look at how we got there. Izzet Lifegain is a weird archetype, and the methods it uses to gain life are not immediately apparent. Buffing up our life total is super important in the mid to late game, so it is essential we get one of these engines rolling before we start to take too many hits. Our main method of maximizing our life is utilizing life gain equipment. Shadow Spear, Basilisk Collar, Batterskull, and Luxodon Warhammer are our primary ways of achieving this, with the collar having the added bonus of killing anything it touches. We couple these life gain equipment with red burn creatures such as Drakuseth, Heartless Hidetsugu, Hammerfist Giant, who's kinda like my spirit animal, and Brash Taunter or Warmonger, in order to gain big bursts of life at once. Cards like Arcbond and Chandra's Ignition also add the life that can be gained. In addition to big bursts of life gain from our equipment and creatures, we also sport a steady stream of life that pours in from our value artifacts. Don't underestimate cards like Paradise Plume, Golem's Heart, and Ivory Tower. There are a lot of janky, but also surprisingly good life gain effects in this category. To list off a few more, we have Sun Droplet, Profane Memento, and Druidic Satchel. Lastly, our life gain payoffs. These are the ways we really take our life total fuckery to the next level. First up, we've got the best card in our deck, Well of Lost Dreams. This thing is really good with cards like Sun Droplet. Speaking of cards that are good with Sun Droplet, Alhammaret's Archive combos with it to gain us 2 life for every 1 life we lose. Big money combos right there, baby. Rounding out all our artifact payoffs, we have this CEDH staple all the way from OG Innistrad. Yep, you guessed it. Chalice of Life and Death. This card seems overcosted and innocuous until I make a copy or two of it and plop down an unwinding clock. In addition to these cards, we also have a few others such as Treasonous Ogre and Ancient Tomb that use our life as a resource. Lastly, having a life cushion is a really nice way to win when closing the game with a surprise Arcbound or Earthquake to burn off the table. But what about the combos I was alluding to earlier in the video? Well, let's get combo looted and break them all down right in the middle of this deck tech. Our first non-infinite combo involves Warmonger, Treasonous Ogre, Dalakos, and 3 equipment. Start with all 3 creatures on board and equipped. Warmonger must have an equipment granting lifelink. Because Dalakos gives flying, our creatures become immune from the damage from Warmonger's ability. Now, we can activate Treasonous Ogre, pay 6 life, and put that mana to deal 1 damage to each creature without flying and each player. This gains us a minimum of 4 life, but also deals damage to us, so we net 3. If there are enough creatures on the board to start, we can usually gain enough of a life buffer that pay 3 life to deal 1 damage, which is basically what this combo translates to, is enough to win it for us. But let's get a little bit more impressive than what is basically a 6-card Aetherflux Reservoir. Our next combo doesn't require Dalakos, and is our easiest to execute and also most fun combination. This combo uses Hammerfist Giant, a diamond in the rough from original Ravnica, to burn out the table at the expense of our own life total. Have our giant Hammer Fister equipped with the lifelink equipment and Umbral Mantle or Sword of the Parents. Also have our homie Treasonous Ogre on the board. Tap the giant to deal 4 damage to each creature without flying, including his big ol' stupid self, and each player. Hold priority with that effect still in the stack and pay 9 life with the ogre to untap the giant. Continue to hold priority and tap the giant again, putting another damage trigger on the stack. Now, pay 9 life again and repeat this process until you're at 5 or less life. If you go any lower, the giant will kill you once you let the first activation resolve. Maybe you want that, maybe that's what you're into. For this deck tech, we're going to assume it's not. Now, pass priority and let the activations begin to resolve. You'll go down to 1 life. Your giant and ogre will perish, but you will start to gain 4 life for each creature and player that the giant deals damage to. Once all the creatures die, you will still net 4 life for each player still. Depending on the life disparity between you and your opponents, this could just kill the table outright. If it doesn't though, it still leaves you with a massively buffed life total advantage and a board devoid of creatures. This makes it easy to pivot into an Aetherflux win or one of our other combos, or even just attack everyone down. Usually I don't have much life left after this anyway. The combo can also go infinite if Hammerhand Giant, Treasonous Ogre, and Dalakos are all present with flying. Since all of our flying creatures can't be damaged by the Hammerhand, we can let the damage from him resolve before tapping him again, thus netting 3 life per loop and burning out the table with infinite life-linking Hammer Fists. Speaking of life-linking Hammer Fists, in the absence of Treasonous Ogre, we can execute a value loop of Hammerfist Giant, some lifelink equipment, either Umbral Mantle or Sword of the Parents, Unwinding Clock, and mana rocks that can produce at least 3 mana. Just tap the giant to deal 4, then pay 3 from our rocks to untap it, and buff its defense with either the sword or the mantle in response. This will mean our unwieldy drunk friend won't kill himself with his own damage, and we can freely tap and untap him again next turn for a total of 16 damage per turn cycle. All of these loops also work with our boy Heartless Hidetsugu and a lifelink equipment, but him and a lifelink equipment is a win con in its own right even without the untap effects, so I figured I would mention him as saving the best for last. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention our other wacky damage life gain value combos that can chain into Aetherflux wins. Stuff like Chandra's Ignition or Arc Bond on a Wormcoil engine can spell doom for the table, especially if we also have a life-linking Brash Taunter on the board. Godo is also a notable win con in his own right, as he and Sword of War and Peace, along with the flying and haste from Dalakos, can inflict 24 damage on a single combat to an opponent with a full hand, so rival blue decks beware. As for weaknesses, like many value-based jank decks that I make, this deck suffers from removal-heavy decks that like to target out our key cards. Additionally, like many life gain decks, we need to be wary of Voltron, Infect, and combo strategies that don't care about the amount of life a player has. Lastly, watch out for Spellslinger decks as well. Although they aren't really a direct counter to us, they can often gain value from being in a pod with us just because the nature of our deck's strategy often keeps the board relatively clear, and Spellslinger decks thrive in games where they don't receive life total pressure. If you are in a game with a Spellslinger deck, make sure that you hold up interaction or focus them down with attacks in order to keep them off their game plan. Notable inclusions. These are the 5 groups of cards that I think are important to showcase for the deck. Our Clone Package. This is one of the ways that we get extra value from the few good life gain effects we possess. Phyrexia Metamorph is an especially flexible all-star that can be anything from a second Sword of War and Peace to another Wormcoil Engine, Silent Arbiter, and Propaganda. These effects keep us from getting chipped down by enemy creatures. Although we are heavy on board control, we are a little light on defensive creatures, and so we must include tools to protect our precious life on the interim turns between our board wipes. Earthquake, Sean's Ignition, Arc Bond. I feel like these cards often get glossed over in the deck list, but they are actually the way we win most often. Arc Bond and Earthquake are especially good at burning out the table, with Earthquake also acting as a board wipe that can spare some of our creatures. Brash Taunter. This guy is another card that can just win games on his own if he's left alone. If I can give him lifelink, it is basically game over if there's no way to bounce or exile him. This guy deals massive burn damage, multiplies all my board wipe effects, is a great blocker deterrent, does work with Basilisk's Collar, and is pretty much the single most powerful individual card in this deck list. And yes, I do run Aetherflux Reservoir and Sword of Light and Shadow and things like that. Brash Taunter is just that good! Plus, look at his fucking art. Only sad thing about him is the flavor fail that he can't block a certain kobold alone. Everything else, just perfect. Druidic Satchel. This card is surprisingly strong in this deck. Plus, it is also very fun to play. One of my favorite cards of all time. All of the effects it can produce are great for us, with the life gain being actually relevant in this build instead of being the mode you never wanted to hit. The Sabrelings can be equipped or smacked with some life gain damage, and I don't really need to go over the advantages of putting lands directly into play untapped. This is another card that is also really good with Unwinding Clock. Notable exclusions. These are cards that I'm still considering or that just barely didn't make the cut. Balefire Dragon, Tyrant's Familiar, and the other Burn Dragons. I like Drakuseth the best out of all of these. I just like how he can find targets even on an empty board. But to be honest, all the creatures in this deck outside the combo ones are all personal preference, so you can add other dragons over stuff like Godo if you so choose. The Niv Mizzets. I keep flirting with the idea of putting my favorite dragon wizard back in this deck, but ultimately for the 6 mana, I would rather be doing other things. He's still really good with lifelink and Well of Lost Dreams though. And if you anticipate less creatures in your games, the Niv boys might be really strong to slot in. Strionic Resonator and Taunos. They just seem too slow and clunky. I don't want to be paying 2 mana to copy what's usually an effect that only gains me a few life to begin with. Blasphemous Act. This staple got excluded because I like the flexibility of our other damage board wipes better. If you want it in, Earthquake is probably the best swap. Vandal Blast. I went for Abrade over Vandal Blast because it is an instant and it might be a bit more flexible. If you don't want your friends to have any artifacts, then maybe put this one in. It's certainly a valid inclusion since we clear creatures so much. We don't want non-creature decks such as artifact decks to be able to pull ahead thanks to our board control. Power level. This is a casual to good precon level deck. It's powerful enough to hang, but not totally oppressive. Also, because it's so silly and out there, it often creates the kind of fun and exciting table conversation that people come to expect from casual games. Because of that, I would say this is a casual deck through and through that sits at or above the level of a strong precon. Bring your version of this deck to game nights with your friends, or in Play EDH Low/Battle Cruiser for some spell table games. Or you could join us on our Discord server and play spell table games with us. Just saying. Overall, Izzet Lifegain, yes it is a fun and excitingly janky, color-shifted casual deck that is sure to leave your opponents scratching their heads at how red and blue managed to gain so much life. It subverts expectations and is sure to lead to some laughs at the table. If you made it this far, please consider hitting the bell, liking, commenting, and subscribing. Show that YouTube algorithm that our videos are worth watching. We are starting to get close to the 500 subscriber mark, and Austin and I have some big plans for when we get there. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.